Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Dr. Rebecca Montacute. I'm Head of Research and Policy at the Sutton Trust. We're the organisation hosting today's webinar. We're a charity who specialise in championing social mobility. So we do research work to try to understand the underlying causes and issues around low social mobility. And we also do programmes in universities and into access and employment that some of you on the call might be familiar with as well. So today's webinar is going to be about the class of 2023, supporting the new intake. So the focus is on the group of young people who are due to be coming into universities this autumn, to try to give you a bit more information about what we know about this cohort, this group of young people, particularly in considering how they've been impacted by the pandemic and what perhaps to expect both for them coming towards university this summer and then once they arrive in the autumn. The data and some of the data we're going to show you today is based on the COVID Social Mobility and Opportunity Study. It's a major national youth cohort study looking at the short, medium and long-term impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on educational inequality. And specifically, the group of young people, there's data on 13,000 young people in the study, is the cohort of young people who are going through, if they're doing them A-levels this summer, who were studying for their GCSEs during the pandemic and had those disrupted, going on to university if they're going this autumn. So we've got really rich information on this specific cohort to be able to share with you today. So just in terms of a couple of housekeeping points before we get properly started. First off, everyone who isn't a panelist should be automatically muted and have your videos off, so other people here can't see you, we can't hear you. Please do enter any questions that you have throughout the webinar into the Q&A function, which you can find on Zoom just below. That is primarily that's where I'll be taking questions from. Someone will be monitoring the chat to pull them across, but if you could please put them in the Q&A rather than put them in the chat so somebody doesn't need to make that move across. And please do ask any questions at any point during the webinar as you think of them. We'll have an opportunity for the questions at the end, but do feel free to pop them in just as you think of them. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible in the allocated time that we've got today. Anything that we're not able to answer in that time will get noted down and we'll answer them after the event. We're recording this webinar and we're going to distribute the recording afterwards. And we also just wanted to start by saying a really big thank you to UKRI and also XTX Markets for their funding of the study that we're going to be presenting the information from. So that's everything in terms of housekeeping. I'm just going to introduce the panelists, if you guys would like to just pop on your video quickly as I do your introductions. So we've got Dr. Jake Anders, who is Associate Professor and Deputy Director of the UCL Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities. We've got 3 young people with us today who are in this cohort. A really big thank you to them for coming along to speaking to us today. That's Riley, Hamza and Amber, who you're going to be hearing from. We've also got Jonathan Maiden. He is a subject leader of science at a school who has taught this cohort of young people as they've gone through the pandemic and will be sharing his experiences. And we've also got Dr. Tammy Thiel, who's Widening Participation, Evaluation and Evidence Manager at the University of Warwick. So a huge thank you ahead of time to all of them for taking the time to speak to us today. We're going to start off with Dr. Jake Anders, who's going to be talking us through some of that COSMO data, giving us a bit more information about this cohort. And for any speakers who aren't speaking at the time, please do just pop your cameras off as well. Thanks, Jake.
And you can all hear me. As Becky said, my name's Jake Anders. I'm the Principal Investigator of COSMO, which means I'm in sort of some overall responsibility for it. I'm just going to take you in a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the findings that we think are perhaps particularly relevant for the topic of this. As societies return to some kind of normality as the COVID-19 pandemic subsides, it's easy to think of the disruption as over and in the past. This is particularly the case as wider challenges have become ever more pressing. But we must not forget the effects of the pandemic on young people's education and well-being cast a very long shadow. The disruption that young people's education faced across multiple academic years have continued to reinforce the immediate effects that we saw. Worse, early signs that impacts have widened existing inequalities, so show no sign of changing. Just as much as it has brought new challenges, the COVID-19 pandemic has also highlighted and exacerbated existing societal challenges. Much has been said about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on mental health, but for me, one of the biggest takeaways is that it has not created a new problem in this respect, simply exacerbated an existing one. Similarly, the pandemic varied in its effects on people, often because of existing societal inequalities. In this chart showing here, we can literally see the evidence stacking up on how learning loss affected those from less advantaged backgrounds the most. And this is studies from all across the world, and the UK is no different in this respect. As Becky's mentioned, I'm going to be drawing on evidence from COSMO. COSMO is a representative sample and study of young people who are currently in year 13 or kind of equivalent to that across England specifically. You can see on this slide how their educational experiences fitted with key milestones during the pandemic. Over 13,000 participants, young people, and 10,000 of their parents reported on their experiences during the pandemic and beyond, and we're extremely grateful to every single one of them for taking part in our study. The data that we're collecting through COSMO helps us to paint a really vivid picture of young people's lives across England during this momentous time, including as a baseline for understanding their transitions to higher education and indeed beyond. Young people's educational experiences during the COVID-19 lockdown has varied a lot. For example, in the early pandemic, the most dramatic differences in the provision of live online lessons were between the state and private sectors. 84% of private school pupils received 3 live online lessons during lockdown 1, compared to 41% of those in state grammar schools and a third of those in state comprehensive schools. State schools with well-off intakes substantially caught up with private schools in this respect during the early 2021 lockdown, but schools with poorer intakes continue to lag behind in provision of live online lessons, likely due to increased need in such schools to focus on important welfare needs. And the differences were not only in what schools could offer. Young people from less well-off backgrounds were more likely to report barriers to home learning. They were less likely to have a quiet space in which to focus, and they were more likely to have to use a mobile device or have to share devices in order to do online activities for their schoolwork. This made a difficult difference for their ability to engage in education during lockdowns. There are systematic differences in our data in the amount of time young people reported spending on schoolwork during lockdowns, depending on the different supports and barriers that they had, that you can hopefully see up on the slide there. In particular, it's perhaps unsurprising that young people who are trying to do schoolwork on a mobile device were spending hours less on schoolwork each week, just because of the additional cognitive burden and difficulty of working in that way. And this was still the situation by the end of the COVID lockdowns. It wasn't, a short-term problem that was fixed quite quickly. It was still the situation at the end of the COVID lockdowns for a non-negligible portion of young people. Due to this disruption and its variability, concerns about being behind in their learning are widespread among this cohort of young people. 4 in 5 young people in this cohort told us that their progress in education had suffered due to the pandemic, and almost half said they disagreed that they had managed to catch up with the learning they had lost when we asked them that this last year. Over a third felt they had fallen behind their classmates, and this rises to almost half for those who attended schools with the least well-off intake. So the differences in this between different social groups, as well as it just being, there overall. On top of this, efforts to help students catch up have not reached as many as we might hope. Almost half of young people said they received no specific catch-up learning at all when we asked them last year. And despite the efforts of the National Tutoring Programme, only 27% of our cohort reported receiving small group or individual tutoring as would be provided under that scheme. and less than a third took up the most available option in terms of these kind of catch-up provisions of extra online classes. Bring this together, young people were kind of evenly split on whether they felt prepared for their next step in education or beyond. As a result, it's likely to be even harder than usual to plan higher education courses curricula to meet pupils where they are starting, but it is vital to do so in order not to leave behind students such as these. Almost half of young people, 44%, are at elevated risk of psychological distress, according to the ways in which they reported in our study. I'll be honest and say the first time I saw these figures, I thought we had messed up somewhere in the way that we were interpreting these. This is a terrifyingly high figure in my view. It was only when looking at the context of the previous cohorts I felt more confident we were highlighting a real challenge. The figure in COSMO is really just the continuation and perhaps a light acceleration due to the pandemic of a trend pointing to a decline in the mental health and well-being of young people across the past decade. High levels of psychological distress reported among those who had had long COVID or who had to shield during the pandemic, with 2/3 of those with severe long COVID reporting high psychological distress. Those who experienced major life events during the pandemic were also more likely to report higher psychological distress, as shown with the predictors on this slide. There are also big differences in mental health by gender identity. Those who identify as female are much more likely to report elevated psychological distress and self-harm compared to those who identify as male. So 54% elevated psychological stress for females, 33% for male. And those who identify as non-binary or in another way are yet more likely to report high psychological distress, a total of 69% of this group of young people. Hopefully in this talk, I've set out some of the key challenges for this cohort that we have identified through our analysis of COSMO data. There are key takeaways regarding the substantial differences in young people's experiences of the disruption during and since the pandemic, including the variation in the extent to which they feel they've fallen behind educationally. This highlights the particular importance of taking into account the variation in young people's experiences as part of admissions decisions and the educational and wider support that students may need once enrolled. This includes the particular issues around mental health that we've highlighted here. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Jake, for that, and really highlights for this whole cohort really what are some of the huge challenges and experience that these young people have been through, and something to consider, especially for the Q&A later. Next up, we're going to hear from some young people actually directly themselves to hear a little bit about their experience as well, and really hugely thankful to the young people who have volunteered to speak to us. Just to say to them that when you're running out of time, I'll pop back up on the screen again just to let you know. So it's going to be Riley who's going to talk to us about their experiences first.
Hello, I'm Riley and I'm from the West Midlands. So COVID left my education in limbo, really. I could see that my school had a clearer class divide than ever before. There was students from sort of local village areas that could afford better educational resources, meaning during lockdowns, they could actually study and they could access resources, whereas I simply couldn't. There was lots of us like me who just couldn't really get into that study mode. And we found that when we came back to school, there was such a clearer sort of divide on who could really keep up with the work and really got to be able to do that work. And those of us who couldn't really at all, there was massive gaps in our learning. To make things kind of even worse, it was not a one-size-fits-all experience, because every different school, every different area had completely different sort of ways that our work was being sent to us and what was done and our exams. And so nobody really had a clear sense of the same sort of experience. And that really made it quite difficult. And by the last lockdown, there was so much work that we were being set, because in the first lockdown, my school barely set anything, and then we had quite a lot. Now, being autistic and having mental health issues kind of just exacerbated the issues I was feeling. I was very lost and isolated. I struggled with the changes happening around me and found that my school wasn't really helping me at all. And they said that I just simply didn't have higher support needs, and therefore I couldn't really access anything inside school. And eventually I was allowed back into school as they realised that I was really struggling. And so I did go into school a couple of times. However, COVID did have some positives. It allowed me to sort of look at my own passions and decide that I didn't want to teach English, but I wanted to take a focus on working in special educational needs. And I did find, however, I really did miss out on lots of the outreaches from universities and colleges, meaning I didn't really get that sort of hands-on experience. And especially from the area I come from, there's not really many of us who go on to university. So it was really key that we got that, and we just didn't really get that. And also we kind of found that none of us really sat our exams. So it was really difficult. And yeah, I feel like universities will find that we have lower entry requirements as well, sort of lower grades, sort of as we go on for the next few years, as we deal with the social and emotional effects of COVID in our educational journeys.
Thank you so much, Riley, for sharing that experience. And next up, we also have another young person, Hamza, who's going to talk to us about their experience.
Hello everyone, my name is Hamza and I'm from the West Midlands. And yeah, just going off Riley, I'd like to talk about my journey with COVID. So I think one of the most obvious points to pick out is the fact that, you know, a lot of people from different backgrounds experience different effects of the pandemic. It was a challenging time for everyone in terms of, you know, in schools, across the workplace, and just the globe as a whole. We felt a lot of challenges. But I think, you know, across the spectrum, in terms of technology, that was a key driver of some of the inequalities that we're seeing today. So at the very start of the pandemic in March 2020, when schools closed down, what we saw was that a lot of people across the country didn't have access to technology and didn't have access to key facilities that they'd usually get in school. And I think one of the main, I guess, features that's come out of this is the fact that since COVID and since people not having access to technology at such a key time, is that we're seeing people fall behind now with the greater expectation of the digital world. So I think for people that, like myself, who didn't have much access to technology during the height of the pandemic, I think what that has now meant is that there's a greater expectation for catching up. And, you know, as we head into university and go on to our educational journeys further, and also I think mental health is one of, I guess that's another key issue that we face as well, is the fact that, you know, having a limited access to technology during the months of 2020 meant that a lot of people didn't have face support that they needed from their friends or family, or the services that they'd usually get from their school. So I think, you know, technology has really been a massive driver of inequality. Now, of course, you know, in the opening decades of the 21st century, we have seen a massive acceleration in technology and its use. But I think particularly in 2020, you know, we've seen a lot more momentum with the pickup of technology and the, I guess, the wider expected use. You know, before lockdowns in 2020, a lot of the work that I did in school was in pen and paper. But I think, you know, across my A-levels now and moving on to my degree, yeah, I'm having to embrace a different style of education. And I guess, you know, it's affecting a lot of people in a lot of different ways, as the data has shown, particularly across state comprehensives and independent schools. There is a massive gap there to be closed. So yeah, I think one of the main ways in which we can, embrace the challenge and rise up to it is, finding out different experiences from different young people and, innovating solutions in which we can all work together and all, I guess, understand the difficulties that we've faced as a cohort with technology and with the challenges of COVID.
Thank you so much, Hamza. Thanks for sharing that. That was really helpful. And
Thank you.
we have Amber, who's also going to share her experience as well.
Okay, so hi, my name's Amber and I'm from outer London. The pandemic for me massively slowed down my academic progress as I fell behind in my work due to not having the technology available to me, nor being able to find a quiet place to work. And I never managed to catch up despite spending about 8 to 10 hours a day in my holidays trying to catch up. My school eventually did help me with my work and prioritizing it. However, because I had spent so long catching up, it meant that my revision had been much less. And so going back to school was a bit of a struggle for me. And I felt that that impacted my GCSEs quite heavily. The other part of the pandemic was that it caused a lot of financial burden for my family, more so than we already had, as my mum had unfortunately lost her job, which meant the prospect of university for me became less likely, as I didn't want to put more financial strain on my mum, but I also didn't want to solely rely on my father's income for any further academic progress. However, despite this, year 13 was not too much of a struggle. And although I found that teachers often tended to rush things due to all of the teacher strikes that have been occurring as of recent, and that obviously made it so that my classmates and myself had to self-teach ourselves a lot of the content. They were, however, very helpful with applying for university for me. And so I managed to get all 5 of my offers and have chosen my final 2. While this option and having that as an option is comforting for me, I want to look more into finding a degree apprenticeship following year 13. But I find that this is where I'm least prepared, as I think schools aren't prepared to help students as well, as much for applying for apprenticeships than they are for universities. As for me personally, there was only one teacher who was willing to help me, and he eventually had to leave suddenly. Despite this though, I'm still making steps towards getting my degree apprenticeship, such as attending job.
Oh, I think maybe we've lost Amber just on the end there. Oh, sorry, Amber.
That's fine.
Thank you so much for that, Amber. Sorry, I'll just have to pop onto the next speaker now, but really appreciate you sharing all of that as well. Great, and then our next speaker is going to give a bit of a perspective from within schools themselves. So we now have Jonathan Maiden, who works as a teacher in a school.
Hi, so I think I could provide a bit of an insight into what it's been like for not only this cohort, but also other cohorts as well. So like there's undoubtedly been a huge impact on this year group, but and as we've heard from the students, enormous impact on their life as well. But I think we have a significant impact on other year groups as well. I think I've anecdotally seen more of an impact, maybe not in terms of their academic, but in terms of sort of social impact on younger year groups. And so I think this is only going to be a problem that maybe gets worse and worse over the next 10 years. It's not something that's going to go away with just this group that sat their GCSEs during lockdown. As to like an insight into the effect that these COSMO group would have had, it was really apparent that many sections of their subject they'd missed out on learning on that. So it's a combination of a subpar experience for them learning the topics remotely, and also that some topics may not have been covered, as the schools were not required to cover absolutely everything for the tag process. And so many students will have missed stuff from that. The next thing was that the tags were really very unreliable. For students that came internally from the lower school into our sixth form, I had an insight into how those tags have been awarded. But for students coming externally, there were wild differences in how tag process was applied. And so those GCSEs that are awarded were not very indicative of how capable the student might be. And of course, they're never perfect. It's never going to tell you everything from that one grade, but it generally will give you more information than what the tag gave that year. The other thing is about sort of preparation for exams. Year 11 and preparation for GCSEs is an important experience for many of the students to become ready for their A-levels and preparing for that. And many students hadn't gone through the process before, or they all hadn't gone through the process before preparing for their GCSEs. And while many of them did a fantastic job with year 13 preparing for their A-levels, they weren't really as able to prepare for those as they would normally. And that's going to feed in for their experience at university as well. They're going to be less experienced at preparing for their end of first year exams than a typical group would be as well. I also think something that's probably quite relevant for the university audience is around grade distributions and university admissions. The GCSE tags that are awarded are probably would just be considered really unreliable. I don't think they should be considered at all, because it's so varied from school to school how the JCQ guidance was applied. And what we saw was very, very high grade inflation across the board. But some schools may have taken a much more conservative approach and awarded a more reasonable set of grades, and therefore arguably disadvantaged their students by awarding grades that were more accurate. I think it also feeds into the predictions that people are going to get for their A-level, and we might likely see lots of clearing as predictions are likely to be overestimating. Not because of people intending to do that, but the grade distributions for which the papers in 2021 and 22 were given out on, there were much greater number of high grades awarded in those years. And if people apply the grade boundaries from the past papers to the scripts that students have sat this year, they're going to generate a much larger number of A and B grades than is likely to occur if the JCQ go ahead with their with what they've said they're doing, which is return to 2019 grade distributions. And so what we'll likely see is lots of students getting a lot lower than their prediction than a typical year, and what the impact of that might be on the clearing process at the end of this year. So it's something that will be very interesting, but I'm very concerned about the impact on some of the students that I teach. So the other thing, the last thing, when I was reading through the data, it was around bias in the tag results. I found that very, very interesting. There was the much higher reporting of bias from state schools than there was in independent schools. And whilst it's really disappointing that that's happened, I think it was inevitable that there was going to be lots of bias in the awarding of tag results because of the nature of the JCQ guidance that was provided to staff. We were very much pushed to take a sort of holistic judgment towards awarding grades rather than using sort of objective data measures. And that's really going to allow for bias to enter into the system. And it really shows the importance of assessments which are marked outside the assessment model that is typically used, where the name and the student is removed from the person that's marking the paper.
Great, thank you so much for that, John. Really helpful to also have that school perspective. We've now got our final speaker before we go to the Q&A, so please do pop any questions you have in that Q&A box. Our last speaker is a university perspective, so I'll hand over to Tammy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Becky. So I was invited, like Becky said, to provide the university perspective on the impacts of COVID-19, discussing some of the research that we've conducted to look at how COVID affected our students at Warwick and changes that we've observed at the university to support students as a result or off the back of COVID. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about the two projects that we conducted in 2020, then I'll look at key findings in relation to the COSMO. So the first research project that we did, which was known as the Access Project, focused on the experiences of students that were in year 13 and had been involved in sustained WP programs offered by Warwick. Then the second project, the Student Success Project, focused on the experiences of students at Warwick from a WP perspective. For both, we used mixed methods, including surveys and in-depth interviews. The Access Project had 77 survey respondents and 13 interviewees, while the Student Success one had nearly 3,000 survey respondents, but from across the university. And then the interviewees were students who had previously taken part in WP Access programs. The Access project that we did in particular provided insights into challenges related to attainment and assessment that we've talked about today, though it focused on the experiences of students who had taken their A-level exams during the lockdown. There's a lot of similarities with what we found there and the COSMO findings and some of the experiences that we've heard about today. So all of the students that we interviewed criticized the system of predicted grades. They often called it disadvantageous, unfair, and biased, but only some of them felt that they would be negatively affected by this. So we found that 55% of survey respondents felt that their center assessed grades would not be better, but less than half felt that they would be worse. Furthermore, we found that there were a lot of students who had very low expectations about the future, this sense that they lacked control, that they felt like sitting ducks waiting for a result that wouldn't reflect them. And they often felt that others, like including their teachers, had low expectations of them. So these findings here resonate with them. Some of the findings from COVID that indicate that a third of young people felt that teachers were biased against certain groups in their teacher assessments. Additionally, while we didn't look at what students actually achieved, the findings from COSMO were really helpful in that regard, and that difference between comprehensive students and independent school students, whereby it was like twice as likely that comprehensive school students reported their grades were lower than expected. So that really came out and I found it helpful. Interestingly, we also found that students who had low expectations were less likely to engage with materials that were provided to them during the school closures. And similarly, they also were less likely to engage in things like tutoring that were available to them through our WP programs. Once at university, there were a variety of different teaching and learning activities, some that have been retained and that could be helpful for learning losses, like integration modules for first years. Then during the pandemic, we also had a Warwick online learning certificate to help students engage with online learning. But again, access to these types of activities hasn't been equal for all, which is similar to the findings from COVID that catch-up hasn't been equal. Again, our projects highlighted the huge mental health and well-being challenges that have come out today. We also found some variations between students at university and those that were in the pre-entry stage, including issues with connectedness and social isolation. They were similar, but they varied even when students had similar characteristics. There's been loads of changes in recognition of the elevated mental health and well-being challenges that students have been facing. For example, the university has a new well-being strategy, but importantly, there's a portal that enables students access to well-being support 24/7. There's also other things like web pages with access to activities and resources. There's been some loads of outdoor activities that were developed during COVID that have been retained, like a giant bouncy castle, outdoor chess, things like this to enable students to connect with each other. There's also been efforts to make links to things like financial support and part-time work more visible, recognizing again the financial challenges and inequalities that COVID itself amplified for many groups. Our studies highlighted these, and we've already talked about financial challenges quite a bit, but there have been some changes to help with that. For example, during COVID, there was computer bursaries that were equipment bursaries of up to £600, so that students could buy a laptop if they needed it. And really before the pandemic, we weren't aware of how many students were relying on the library to study. There's other forms of financial support, like there's hardship funds and bursaries, which we've evaluated and found to be effective for leveling the playing fields. But unfortunately, these types of resources aren't easily to access and they're not necessarily available to all. So given all the challenges and issues that we've discussed today, it's important that this kind of thing is taken account, and hopefully universities will consider this when they're deliberating their strategies and approaches for supporting students going forward. So that was me. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And a big thank you to all of our speakers, especially really to the young people for sharing their experiences. We've already had a couple of people saying specifically in the chat they were really impressed, and a really big thank you to those 3 students. So really thank you to all of you. If everyone who spoke could please pop their cameras back on, as we're now going to do the Q&A. We've already had a few questions in, but please do keep popping them in as we go through if there's anything else that you would like to ask. I'm going to start off on one about the cost of living crisis. So obviously we've heard a lot here about the impact of the pandemic, but we have gone kind of from that crisis straight into another one in the form of the cost of living crisis, high inflation, lots of people having difficulty affording things. Do any of you have any perspectives on that? Perhaps if we could start there with John, if you've seen that at all in your school.
Well, I'm not in a pastoral role, so I don't deal with it in a sort of day-to-day way in the same way as heads of year will. But I work in a very deprived area of London. It is always an issue, and it has been in this area before the pandemic as well. There was always like loads of students that don't have the appropriate uniform, appropriate equipment, and the school goes to great lengths to ensure they have stuff by the time the school day starts. But it's something that has probably gotten worse, but it's an issue that was there before. I don't work in an area where there weren't issues before the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, so I don't really quite have an insight into whether that's got dramatically worse or not.
Great. Jake, is there anything useful from any of the COSMO data to tell us anything about the cost of living?
The issues that have particularly emerged further in terms of cost of living, including things like food bank use. We've done analyses of the COSMO data that have shown that among those who are otherwise similar but have had to use food banks did worse in their teacher assessed but nevertheless GCSE grades than otherwise similar students whose families aren't using food banks, suggesting just the additional burden on family time and life and things is part of the fact that may be getting in the way of education where that is having to be done. And I would expect to see that sort of only getting worse with additional cost of living pressures subsequently, with that spreading to a larger group and likely affecting A-level performance and potentially beyond that as well, in terms of impinging directly on education while at university.
Amy, is there anything you'd like to add on this from a university perspective and what you've seen from the cost of living crisis?
Yeah, like they've all said, that it's really exacerbated some of the issues that we've seen, and universities, not just Warwick, but I've been looking at other universities along the way, are trying to do things like some are offering their own food banks and things that might help, but I think more needs to be done in general, right? I think that's the general consensus to support with this.
And just to the 3 young people, don't feel at all like you need to share anything if it's personal circumstances, but if there's any reflections you have on how going through this crisis and then through to the cost of living crisis has impacted your age group. If any of you are happy to speak, just pop your mic off. Riley?
I found that it kind of just meant that it was so difficult because we all had so many different sort of circumstances, and we found that we have more open conversations, I think, with each other a lot more. I think young people are more supportive of people because we're all sort of feeling that effect of sort of what's happening, which kind of is nice in a way because we kind of all sort of respect that. But I feel like there is such a bigger divide now, and you can tell that there are some of my friends who aren't really that concerned about it, and then there are others of us who are really concerned about it. And it does sort of make you think about university a lot more. Like, I think a lot of us have started to think about our finances a lot earlier.
And Amber and Hamza, do you have anything to add on, like, support you'd like to see from universities, maybe, given the cost of living crisis?
I mean, I think it would be kind of like Riley mentioned, the circumstances are so different based off of like people's experiences, and because it's so different, it would be hard for universities to find a specific way to help each student, because it is based off of individual differences. Like I know for me personally, the cost of living crisis made things a lot harder for my family. And we ended up at one point starting to rely on coupons given to us from my school, which was only provided because they found out through the youth panel, the COSMO youth panel that I was in. And so I think, because that's only for like a certain amount of students, and I think it would solely depend, because a lot of my friends I know aren't really that worried, as people have mentioned. But for me personally, a big thing that put me off universities was the finance and whether I could potentially afford it. So for that sense, the cost of living crisis has affected it quite greatly.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really appreciated, Amber. Do you want to add anything there, Hamza?
Yeah, so in terms of financial support, I think, yeah, extended use of bursaries, means tested. I think that will really alleviate some of the technological challenges. I also think there should be a greater emphasis on access at university. So like a union that represents students that might have difficulties from different backgrounds, accessing technology or welfare support, or differences in education. So I think people and use of bursaries would help to at least lessen some of those issues.
Great, thanks so much, all. I'm going to take the next two questions at once, I guess, as a bit of a summary for some of these views here. But one of the questions is, what do you think this does all mean for admissions this summer? The person said they're interested in the inflated predictions as well as lost learning, but what would you like to see universities do? And then in terms of what universities can do with these findings to take forward, what would you also like to see in terms of the support offered to students? If we could start perhaps with Tammy this time.
So yeah, that's a really complicated question, because from what I understand, there's some kind of well, the system itself has some kind of recognition that students have been affected by COVID, but university admission systems themselves haven't necessarily taken that into account now, like they did before. But now it's an overall thing, but there is things like contextual offers and mitigating circumstances that get taken into account for those students that have experienced the mitigating circumstances that have experienced greater disruption. But those aren't necessarily systematically approached. So that's one challenge potentially. But overall, things like contextual offers could be helpful for recognizing that. And I think there has been greater use of contextual offers for educational institutions across England, especially.
And anything you'd like to see in terms of support that like all universities should be offering once students arrive?
Yeah, so I think there's things like integration modules, that are generic content for all students, starting off recognizing that people could have potential gaps in knowledge, to ease people in early and help with that transition. I think that's crucial, and Warwick does offer that, but I don't know if it's like across all different departments. Other universities I know also have offered like a lot of extra things before you start, like anyone that's an offer holder, say, offering them the reading lists, access to like Moodles and things like that so that they can prepare. So I think that kind of stuff is really helpful.
Great, thank you. To the three students, is there anything, you've got an audience of people that work in universities, what would you like to see both in their admissions decisions in the summer and also in support that they offer students once they start for those going? If anyone wants to say anything, just pop. Riley?
Yeah, I think it's about kind of preparing us now, because we're also, I think we definitely need sort of that more support on student finance, because some of us didn't even know how to do the application, for starters, for just general student finance. And then sort of to add on top sort of how we work around budgets, sort of what our costs are going to be at university, because there might be lots of costs that we don't really know about. And so sort of like making sure that we have that preparation, or having things like the offer holder days that kind of give us a chance to sort of get that little bit of a head start, things like study skills, all of those things that we might have kind of missed out on that might help us to sort of get into university, because I think the first few weeks and months could be quite a challenge.
Great, thank you. And to Amber and Hamza, someone's asked in the chat, have you had good access to careers advice? Do you feel like you've had good guidance there? And for your cohort, would you like to see universities doing anything to try to address any of those gaps going forward? What do you think would be helpful? Are either of you happy to Hamza?
I think in terms of some of the online resources that we find nowadays, I think particularly young people need to find platforms in which they can network and find career support that way, or even internships. I think, you know, we've seen a bigger emphasis on people independently going out and finding what suits them best and doing that through online platforms. So I think definitely exposing people to greater use of digital resources and networks that way, I think that will be of great help.
Amber, do you want to add anything on any kind of support or reflections on what you think might help this group of young people?
I mean, in terms of careers opportunities, that's something that I was heavily looking into, because I knew where I was sort of heading, and so I was looking more at degree apprenticeships. And I mentioned in my thing that in my talk earlier that I tended to find it was much harder for looking at apprenticeships, and that's partly because there's not many as it is, because I don't think universities work as much with companies to offer degree apprenticeships as much as it probably should, because I think more people are beginning to look at that as a potential option. But I think also just the support in general in schools should potentially get like more in depth, because I didn't have much support when I was looking at stuff myself. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And John, do you have any reflections from a school perspective on what you want to see happen in admissions decisions this summer and support once people get into university?
Yeah, in terms of admission decisions, it's very difficult to tease out the difference between the lower socioeconomic background students that have been, as the evidence shows, more disadvantaged by lockdown, and those that were more advantaged during lockdown. That's obviously a massive challenge for the universities to solve. Yeah, anecdotally, I've seen more contextual offers for students that I teach receiving those. So it makes sense to me that universities are doing more of that. Something I've seen with outreach, it's very clear that all of the in-person outreach events shut down during lockdown for obvious reasons, but it seemed very slow to reopen. And I also saw that like certain offers that used to be in place didn't ever reopen. And so things that I had done prior to lockdown just were no longer available, or were only available online. And that was, it was less interesting to the students. There would be like a lower uptake from the students in those activities. Lots and lots of activities that would have previously been, say, in person, say going along to lectures and stuff. Many of those are now online, and that's got the advantage of being much easier for the students to attend. But for many students, the idea, the thing they need from outreach is not exposure to the subject so much as breaking the idea that university isn't for them. And an online lecture isn't going to really help with that, I don't think. They need to go along and feel the experience of being on campus or at the university site, and feeling the idea that the university is a place they could actually go to. And I fear that online outreach events are going to do absolutely nothing to really break that idea, as sort of online lessons that they've been there, done that with their learning during lockdown.
Thank you. And Jake, do you have anything to add on this as well? Oh, Jake, you're on mute.
I have a sort of huge amounts of knowledge of the practice change per se, but and it doesn't kind of follow directly from our data, but I think the integration and the plugging together of the pastoral support and the knowing who is facing those challenges with the academic support seems to me just very important in terms of making sure that universities respond holistically to the challenges that these students seem to be facing.
Great, thank you. And then the next question we've got is actually directed at the young people, if you guys are happy to answer this, which is, how do you feel at the moment about hybrid learning, given everything you've been through in the pandemic? If that was going to be offered to you either in university or as part of an apprenticeship later, do you think you'd think, no, I don't want to be looking at a screen at all, or would you be quite happy to do that? How do you feel about it at the moment? Is anyone happy to answer that? Thanks, Riley.
I don't think I would particularly mind, because I've gotten used to it. Like, I've gotten used to sort of having to use online resources. But I think we do sort of have this little bit of hesitancy about it, because it's always sort of like, we are kind of sick of always having to use a screen. But I think it gives more access to things. It definitely allows us to have, you could be sort of further away from something and have the opportunity to sort of still take part in something. And so I think I wouldn't necessarily not do it, but I think I would really have to think about sort of what percentage I would be spending online and how much would be in person. And I think it really depends on the subject, because certain things don't really work online as well as other things do work online.
Great, thank you. Amber and Hamza, do you have anything to add on that?
What I'd like to say is, whilst online learning is more efficient in its delivery and is a great option to many students, what it takes away most importantly is an environment in which students can engage with their learning. I think looking at a screen at home is much different to being on campus, being in a classroom and really just engaging with the learning content and with your peers, and just excelling within your academia. So I think whilst it should remain an option for people to download content online or watch back webinars, I think it's really important that there is a space in which they can find themselves productive and access support should they need it.
Great, Hamza, thank you. And then I've just got one final question, if this could go to John, Jake and Tammy before we just do a little quick wrap up, which is, and John, I'll start with you as you touched on this before. Do you see the impact of this inequality is going to continue for further years, for longer? Do you think it's mainly going to be this cohort of students? What are you kind of expecting in the long term?
It's difficult to be very precise. I think probably the trend I've seen in an anecdotal sense is that the impact of sort of lost academic learning, say particular topics weren't covered properly, it was very difficult to teach that topic, for example, down a screen. That's probably more pronounced in the older students. So with the COSMO cohort being the sort of the oldest group, they were exposed to that. As you go down into the younger year groups, I think there's probably less in terms of specific areas that they didn't learn very well, but it's more an impact on their social skills. I think the younger groups that were in primary school during lockdown, I've observed more of a challenge in terms of their social skills than with the older groups. It also feeds into sort of masked learning as well. The older students having to learn in masks, they've already developed their social skills more thoroughly. They're obviously not completed in that process, but they're more fully formed young adults. Whereas students that say were at primary school without wearing masks, they're in a very, very early developmental stage. And so they've been enormously impacted by not being able to see people's faces. They're generally less capable of sort of conflict resolution than students of an equivalent age. And so they've been much more challenging. I found like the classes I've taught that were younger are more challenging than I remember from years prior. And so that's going to feed through for many, many years.
Jake, do you have anything to add on this? Obviously, the COSMO cohort is one specific age group, but do you have any feelings about long-term impacts?
What John says is exactly right. I mean, I don't think the COSMO cohort is likely to be like those around it in a lot of ways, and things will change sort of incrementally over time. I mean, I'm sure a lot of the challenges we've been talking about that are there in COSMO are already present in cohorts that already started, obviously, as witnessed by Tammy's work, for example, and I'm sure a lot of the people on this course first-hand experience. But I think the nature of it will change over time, but we have seen, there is evidence of learning loss a long way down the age distribution of those in school at the moment. So I don't think I expect to see that element of it go away per se, although we would hope that continued efforts around catch-up, particularly if things like National Tutoring Programme do continue, and it doesn't seem quite clear exactly what that's going to look like going forward, but would help to mitigate that over time. But it's a very uncertain picture in that respect at the moment, and continuing to try and understand that from ongoing monitoring work that will be done through things like the National Reference Test will be important to keep understanding the picture of how that may be changing.
Great, thank you. And Tammy, do you have any reflections perhaps from the cohorts you've already seen come through? Have there been differences? What would you expect over time?
Yeah, so there have been differences, and like Jonathan discussed some of the social issues that younger age groups have been experiencing, like at crucial stages of their development by not being exposed to other people, sometimes staying at home. I think that's had an impact that could last. And there has been like a lot of studies that have shown inequalities in attainment that start very early. So this was already a problem before, and we know that COVID has exacerbated it. But it will be interesting to see how that plays out, and how in turn like national efforts to address attainment gaps might improve that. So we do see differences, and I think it's important also to point out that the differences vary for different groups. So it's students that have intersectional characteristics. We see how there's differences in the attainment outcomes of students from different ethnic minority groups. So it's very complicated, but I think that there will be some lasting effects, and I'm happy to see also that there is a lot of attention given to that, and there's efforts being made to try and address that. But yeah.
Great, thank you. And a really big thank you to all of our panelists for speaking today, and especially to the 3 young people who've spoken. We really appreciate you sharing your experiences with us. So we've heard a lot about the varying kind of challenges, experiences from the young people who were so heavily impacted by the pandemic, how they had such different experiences both during the pandemic itself, whether or not they've been able to access catch-up, and there are still many young people who haven't had that access, and that we are likely to be seeing the impact of this coming through the school system and into universities for quite a few years to come. We've also heard about some of the things that universities themselves could do in terms of those differences in attainment that we're likely to see. So really thinking about contextual offers, and it's great to hear John's experience. He thinks more students have been getting those kind of offers at his school. And anyone here who is working directly in admissions at a university, we'd really welcome, first off, any views you've got on this if you want to send anything through to us afterwards. But please do go out and talk to people in your departments. What is it that your university is doing at the moment in terms of giving extra consideration? Are there things in place for when actual final results come in and making those final decisions? If a young person has only just missed a threshold, is there something that you can do there? We've also heard all the way through about a lot of the mental health challenges as well that young people have faced, a lot of the issues around social interaction, and some of the challenges there, and really the need for that kind of wraparound support. And importantly, these young people haven't just been through that one crisis. Actually, they've been through the pandemic, then they've gone through the cost of living crisis, and a lot of them will still be feeling a lot of the impacts of that in terms of their financial health, and with ongoing impacts then to their mental health as well, and their ability to work and do well. And that's something that universities really need to think about, and that wider support that they're giving them. we've heard that great example from Tammy at Warwick about some of what that kind of support for students coming in and making sure that they're on a level able to kind of catch up and interact with the university course. And we'd really encourage you, and I think we will try to perhaps share some more information on Tammy's programme as well. I think someone asked that as a question, so we'll talk to you, Tammy, about that afterwards. And just a really big thank you to all the panelists and also to everyone who asked questions. There's a few that we didn't get to. We will try to send out answers to those afterwards as well. And thank you so much to everyone for coming along to watch. Thanks.